Welcome back to American Republic. We are continuing the U.S. entering the war to fight against the Axis. We're at big letter B, waging the war in Europe. Also make sure maybe you want to star this, highlight this, circle this, do what you need to do, because this is the topic of another essay. So please make sure that you know that. If you want more information on this essay, it's found on pages 462 to 466 in the textbook. Be able to know basically how the war in Europe took place. The more specific you are, the better your score on the essay will be. The U.S. did not ignore the situation in the Pacific. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, but it will send most of its forces to Europe initially. Number one, invading North Africa. German forces led by Erwin Rommel captured most of North Africa early on in the war. Italy had begun the fight in North Africa, but Britain had pushed them back. In order to help his ally, Hitler sent his Africa Corps, led by Rommel, which pushed the British back into Egypt. By mid-1942, the U.S. had joined the war effort in North Africa. America's first major war activity was called Operation Torch. U.S. forces led by Dwight D. Eisenhower, future president, counterattacked and defeated the German forces. With U.S. forces pushing in from the west and British forces pushing in from the east, German troops were crushed between the two in Tunisia. If you look at page 464, that's a good page to be on as we go through this section. 464, it shows you a map of the European theater. While Rommel managed to escape, over 240,000 Axis troops were forced to surrender in 1943. Number two, invading Mediterranean Europe. This operation was known as Operation Husky. This is the next attack, and it will take place in Italy. U.S. troops invaded Sicily, which, as you know, is the island off of Italy, and then they marched into Italy. Naples fell in October 1943, but German defenses kept the U.S. out of central Italy for a time. Finally, in 1944, Italy surrendered and overthrew Mussolini. The Italians had grown tired of the war. They overthrew Mussolini, they surrendered to the Allies, and they declared war on Germany. This is a joke, but just recognize, if you ever start World War III, make sure Italy is not on your side at the beginning of the war, because so far we've seen them switch sides twice in 2 world wars. Well, that's just a joke, but still historically accurate. The U.S. liberated Rome, but Germany continued to hold northern Italy, as you can see on the map on the screen, as well as the map in your book. Fighting will continue there for another year. Number 3, invading France. As the Allied invasion of Europe approached, German intelligence worked to determine where it would occur. The Allies planted misinformation in German hands, suggesting that Norway or northern France would be the landing zone. When Allied efforts to prepare the Norway site stopped, the Germans believed it confirmed that northern France would be the site of invasion. The belief persisted even while the Normandy invasion was in progress. False information fed to the Germans said that the attack at Normandy was only a covering for a larger attack that would come later in northern France. Instead of reinforcing their forces in Normandy, the Germans waited for an attack that never came. Misinformation rules the day. On June 6th, 1944, on a very testable date, D-Day, again led by Eisenhower. This is the largest amphibious invasion force in history, crossed the English Channel and moved into France. Sorry that part of the word largest is not bold. The whole word should be. Sorry about that. Haha. Get over it. Allied leaders had to consider tide schedules and weather reports. This invasion became the turning point in the war. General Eisenhower reported, "The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory." While the Allies bombed targets and dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines, American and British forces fought on the beaches of Normandy. Losses were heavy, but slowly the Allies were able to gain ground on German forces. In October of 1944, Paris was liberated and German forces were pushed back into Germany. Once Paris was liberated, German resistance collapsed rapidly. German forces fell back to the Rhine River, which is the border between Germany and France. In December of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge took place. This was Hitler's last-ditch attempt to break the Allied lines. It failed. It's called the Bulge because literally it created a bulge in the Allied lines as the Germans pushed into Belgium and into France, but it will fail. At the end of the month, the momentum had slowed. By the beginning of 1945, the Allies had begun pushing German forces back again. Hitler's last effort to win the war came in 1944 at the Battle of the Bulge counterattack in southern Belgium and the Ardennes forest in Luxembourg. The Allies were forced to retreat, and the German advance created a bulge in the front line. Within the bulge, a pocket of resistance remained. The Americans' 101st Airborne Division still controlled the city of Bastogne. Though facing cold weather, low supplies, and a German siege, the Americans refused to surrender. On December 22nd, the Germans sent a message to the Americans demanding their surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe reportedly replied, "Nuts!" Apparently that means no. The Germans were not happy with the reply and continued their attack even through Christmas Day. Allied aircraft dropped provisions and weapons to the Americans inside Bastogne. Finally, on December 26th, the 4th Armored Division of Patton's 3rd Army reached Bastogne and relieved the 101st Airborne Division. You can see the Bastogne, the city located right here. Number 4, German defeat. While the Allies fought northward from Italy and eastward from the Rhine, the Soviets fought their way westward toward Berlin. American forces probably could have won the race with the Russians and arrived at Berlin first, but a political decision forced them to delay. The Russians were allowed to take Berlin. As this progression had continued, many of the Allied forces began to witness the truth into how terrible Nazi Germany had been. The Holocaust, Hitler's effort to exterminate the Jewish people in Europe. As the Allies pushed into Germany, they discovered the slave labor camps and death camps that the Germans had set up. The Allied soldiers were sickened and angered by what they found at such places as Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Mauthausen, Nordhausen, and Ravensbrück. Millions had been murdered in these death camps. Often American commanders made Germans who lived in the surrounding towns and villages march through the death camps to see what their toleration of the Nazi regime had produced. At the Yalta Conference, the last meeting of FDR, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin took place, where they recognized Soviet special interests, as they called it, in Eastern Europe. By doing so, Stalin promised to enter the war against Japan. He also promised to hold post-war elections in the Eastern European countries that the Soviets liberated. That promise proved to be a lie. Churchill warned about the Soviets, but FDR felt it necessary to appease Stalin. This will be the last meeting of the Big Three. Within a few months, Roosevelt would be dead, and Britain will elect a new prime minister to replace Churchill. On May, there's a picture of the Yalta Conference and the Big Three there. On May 8th, 1945, known as VE Day, Victory in Europe, Germany surrendered and the war in Europe was over. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. Berlin fell to the Soviets on May 2nd. Now American efforts turn to finishing off the Japanese in the Pacific. That's all we're going to cover for today. For your homework, you need to do pages 203, 204, and 205 in your activities book. So page 203 to 205 in the activities book, that is entitled Life for a Japanese American Internee. I told you how terrible and horrible the Japanese imprisonment, or I should say American imprisonment of Japanese American citizens were. So I want you to read this first-person account of the events that take place. Please make sure that you answer all 8 questions on the homework. Hope you all have a good rest of the day. Be good, do good. Bye.